Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we talk about all things cube but with refreshments. I am your host, Stu. I'm here joined by my other hosts,
Anthony.
And
me, Amay.
Hi, Amay. Hiya, Anthony. Today we've got a bit of a, we expected this one to be a bit of a shorter episode than some of our previous. And today we're going to talk a little bit about green, everybody's favorite color in Magic, except everybody. And we're going to talk a bit about mid-range, and we're going to talk about how to really beef up your mid-range packages, specifically in that 3 to 4 CMC range, which typically has been like not the hardcore rampy section, which is like in your 1 to 2, and not your like big like balmy cards like your Crater Hoofs and so on and so forth. So Tireless Tracker at 3 CMC and Questing Beast at 4 CMC. Thank you for listening. We really hope you check out our Discord and reach out to
Whoa, hang on, back this up.
Hang on.
We're going to do an episode. What are you doing?
I'm finishing it off. We're talking about mid-range. What more do you need to talk about? Is there more?
Yes, there's more.
Oh my God.
There's more to green, 3 to 5 drops.
Hang on a second. Do I need to mention Courser of Crufix?
Are you done now? Moving to the social.
Well, I guess this is a little bit more complex than I originally gave it credit for, but okay, fine. May and Anthony are here. We're talking about green. We're talking about mid-range. So again, we're talking about this gap, right? It's the gap between like the little itty-bitty dorks, your Llanowar elves, you know, that are just powering out your mana, ramping you up, and then your really big, balmy creatures, right? Your Crater Hoof behemoths, whatever you've got at your top end of your
And then that dead zone.
And then the dead zone.
Right? And we want to get rid of the doldrums of green. That's what we're trying to remove from this episode. And before we go any further down this conversation, we do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our libations of the show. Stu, let's start out with you since you were so hasty.
I don't even have a beer anymore. Oh, I have that. Do you have beer?
You were so fast to end, you don't even have a beer.
Since Stu was so hasty to just wrap up this episode with the green mid-range equaling 2 cards, but before we go any further, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our libations of the show. We're going to start out with May. May, what do you have in this evening?
I'm actually going to be responsible, and I'm drinking water.
Ooh.
Drink your water, people.
I should be responsible, but I'm not. I'm having another one of these delicious Hidden Pipe Porters. It's a coffee porter from the Raleigh Brewing Company here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Anthony, what you got?
And I'm going to have a Highland Brewing's Oatmeal Porter, which is delicious, dark, roasty, and smooth.
Ooh, just like
me.
All right, crank them.
All right, so you were pretty excited about just naming a couple of cards here, but you want to kind of give an overview, you know, a little bit, a synopsis of what we're trying to do. They're talking about this dead zone.
We're talking about the dead zone. I like that. I like that term, right?
I like the dead zone.
I like dead zone. That's pretty cool. So the super low CMC 1, maybe 2 rampy kind of green creatures, right? So Llanowar elves, Ignoble Hierarch, Noble Hierarch, right? The cards that you are never sad to see in your opening hand because you know now that you can bang these out in the first turn or 2 and then start really powering out your higher drops, right? The higher drops, the 7, 8, 9, 6 even, right? Prime
Evil
time.
Titan, right?
Those are well established.
Yeah.
But what happens before that? What happens at 5?
How do you make green great?
What happens at 4? What happens at 3? Outside of Questing Beast, right? Memes aside, I love me some Questing Beast. But that exists in a kind of a unique space. I actually made the comment a very long time ago in one of our previous episodes. I think it might have been to Derek Gallen or JP or one of those people. And I said, I actually think that Questing Beast is one of the few cards that's actually holding green aggro to be relevant, right? Because it does occupy,
besides
it just kind of fill
Baloth,
a little bit. Besides Leatherback Baloth and Colonian Hydra, okay? Those speak for themselves.
Those are clearly.
But where is green's identity in the mid-range? Right? In that 3, 4, 5, 6, outside of just maybe you play lands from the top of your library, maybe you ramp a little bit more. Does it have more than that? And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode.
Yeah, so it oftentimes green suffers from being a utility color, right? Like if you're going to drafting mono green, removing Gaia's Cradle and things like that from the equation oftentimes becomes challenging. And then it often, and May, I want your thoughts on this, is viewed as the weakest of the color pie, where it used to be white, but suddenly white has become this infamous, if not dominant, vintage cube, get in there fast and furious playstyle, that it's kind of pushed green into this weird little zone by itself. Do you agree with that statement?
I want to make a question first for May before even that. Do you agree that green has always been or has since been pushed down and white has been the weaker one? Because I'm not quite sure I agree with that. May, tell me what you
I don't
think.
agree with either of those
I don't agree with that.
That's
So,
fair.
The problem with green basically runs up to the game has become power crept. More and more creatures are effectively spells, and they have values, and the gray area between Mole Drifters and Bane Slayers is great. That line is no longer as clear as it used to be. Back in the days of old, green could easily just pull a bunch of stompy creatures, play like Rook's Companion into Leatherback Bailoff turn 3, and then have their little stompy core and whatever, right? Or they could play their Birds of Paradise into Leatherback Bailoff, just as a specific example, right? And the reality is that Leatherback Bailoff doesn't cut it anymore. Just getting a vanilla 4/5 isn't enough nowadays. And the more and more that we have this complexity creep going on, the more and more green gets pushed back into the corner, which is why Questing Beast stands out so much, because it has so much word soup. It does so much that it manages to stay relevant because of it. You are happy spending a dork to go into Questing Beast, because Questing Beast helps you close a game over time.
Because we talked about it in a previous episode where it breaks the color pie. And we talked about the color pie where it takes all these different components. It has pseudo unblockable for a certain value of creature. It has haste. It has vigilance. It has all these different attributes of the different components of the color pie. And whereas green a lot of times has kind of had this like trample, reach, stompy, just very generic, leatherback Bailoff, like we talked about, right? Or Colonial Hydra. Those were kind of the epitome of that idea. They just were efficient creatures for their rate, even though they're vanilla. And if you got enough of them on the battlefield, you could win through just sheer might. And when I was saying weakest, I don't mean brawn versus weakest. I mean more of it's weakest through the vision of curators and through drafters, because it does feel more of a utility component, like rampant growth, stuff like that they're looking for to make their other colors better instead of being a standalone creature.
That's it right there. Green's ability to shine in a lot of environments, for me, okay, is not about the ability to put creatures out there in early turns that have the ability to take over the game. Those days seem to be long gone for me, right? Because the other colors have far more impactful creatures in the first 1, 2, and 3 turns. I don't care about a Llanowar Elves. I don't care about an Elvish Mystic. I care about a Ragavan, right? That's what I want on turn 1. Or a Dragon's Rage Channeler. Or a Mother of Runes. And Mother of Runes, this is why I would disagree a little bit. I don't think that white was sort of in that backspace. I think white has always been at the forefront and has always had one of, if not maybe the most premium one-drop creature of all time. You can make arguments for, Mother of Runes and Deathrite Shaman and Ragavan as it exists nowadays. But green has been relegated, and while I do agree to a utility, green is not about creatures anymore. Green is only about ramp, but it's not even about ramping creatures anymore. Green is about the utility. And it's kind of a sad thing for me. I do kind of feel sad about it, because I've played those modern stompy decks. I've played mono green, just try and run over with creatures. They're not viable anymore.
I want to take a moment to pause and do a shout out for an amazing podcast called Powerful Nothing. And they've got about 12 to 15 episodes, give or take. And they're doing a fantastic job. And they actually covered this topic as May was actually writing this one. They talked about this topic extensively. And I'm going to include in the show notes a link to their podcast, which I think they're fantastic. And they spoke to this so eloquently that, we're at a real challenge here to even try to keep up, because they just did such a great job. So I will include that. And I didn't want to just, not talk about that. Powerful Nothing.
We should.
Fantastic
promote
website.
the heck out of
fantastic.
all of
If you're
these
looking
other
for a great,
wonderful creators.
you got LPR, you got UberCube, but now you've got Powerful Nothing, and I'm impressed. They're great.
Excellent.
So another thing that Green does is you had to have that gap, right? Like, it doesn't have really that Savannah Lion Goblin Guide threat that we talked about. Well, how do you beat that? Well, there was a coinage that came up, and it was the Unga Bunga package, which I think was that from Donkey Kong Jr., or which one was that? Country.
Donkey
Kong Country, right?
Yep.
They did the Unga Bunga. But how did you support something besides your Fendorn Elves, your Jorga the Tree Speaker, and then eventually get to your Craterhoof Behemoth or Woodfall Primus? That was that stopgap, that dead zone, that doldrum that Green had. Do you even want to get to the Craterhoof Behemoth?
That's a great point.
You were
the question should not be can you. The question is should you?
Should you
have such great value in those 3 and 4 and maybe 5 CMC slots that you can just take over the game there before you've even
get to
cast
Craterhoof.
your Craterhoof, or even before you've got to your Primeval Titan.
Right.
Like Primeval Titan is still just a busted card, right? It's bonkers. You don't need to do too much before you get to 6 mana. If you're casting a prime time, you've now got a 6/6 trample, and you've got 2 additional lands, and it's 2 any land. So now you're talking about you don't even probably want more ramp at that point. You just want utility lands. But now what happens?
Yeah. So how did you combat that Boros aggro strategy, right? Otherwise, you were hoping to Fendor Elf, you were doing Llanowar Elves, fast, rampant growth, cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and hope to God you have enough dorks out there to, I got them with Craterhoof, right? That was there was a point in time where that was your strategy, right? Or to get to prime time.
Yep.
But that was it. You had this huge dead area, and your hope to be alive by the time you've had enough Savannah Lions coming at you, you couldn't do anything about it. So you had to defend against that. So that's what the Unga Bunga, or as May has coined it, the Yahoo package.
I love how you mispronounced it and put it wrong in the notes. A woo. A woo package. Because they're wolves. A woo. You'll get there eventually.
I've got an Australian Shepherd. It does a woo.
Anyways, the quick note that I wanted to make is that one of the biggest problems with that strategy and why that it's fallen off is that, cool, great, you have a pile of dorks, assuming that your opponent hasn't interacted, and then you drop Craterhoof, maybe. But Craterhoof and Primetime are so expensive relative to the complexity creep that's happened just in Magic as a whole that it no longer cuts the mustard. Now those are cheat targets. Most of the time, people are drafting those because they're looking for ways to cheat into the play. They're looking for ways to get past the ramp. And what happens is that the ramp deck is now left there without relevant, even extreme top-end pieces, which hasn't been relevant for a long time. And when you're looking at your ramp pieces, it's important to think about what's your good 3 drops, 4 drops, and 5 drops, because that's what your dorks are going to be getting into. Skipping forward a turn on your mana is huge when you don't have, say, rocks, powers, etc. And when green is so far left behind, a lot of times we have to circumvent that for value cards like Rex Sage, Eternal Witness, the Centaur, what is his name?
Courser of Krufix.
Thank you. Point is that we have a lot of these cards, but none of them are scary. None of these cards hit the board after a dork, and your opponent's like, oh, I need to answer this, or I have to do something about it. Except for Questing Beast, which comes up a lot.
I actually think Courser of Krufix is a bit of a must answer. I think Courser of Krufix has the ability to ramp quick enough and has a body that kind of needs to be a bit of an answer. Or you need an answer to it fairly quickly.
It's a value engine.
But a point that we will be talking about later is that usually when you have the choice between Krufix and, say, a Garruk or a Planeswalker or etc., that's going to be a lot more of an impactful choice if you don't have that land package or you're not trying to get that extra ramp. You're trying to make something impactful now.
And I think, so to put this into context, the list where I pulled this from, we're going to talk about May's Fey Cube. We talked about the AU package.
Awoo.
But
Awoo. Stu gets it.
In this case, we pulled it from my Vintage Cube, which is a 540. And I had to solve this problem in that environment as well, because I was doing the mana dork, primetime, cratered hoof type of play. And how do you fill that gap, that dead space? And we talked about in a previous episode, specifically in Uberbear's Artifact Cube, I had listed in the bombs the card Tireless Tracker. And in that environment, due to the fact that there were no fetches, it suddenly became contextually devalued, right? Yes. And Tireless Tracker, for those that aren't familiar, and you should be, is for 2 colorless and 1 green. You get a human scout, 3/2. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, investigate. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. In an environment that has fetches, or in the case of when you're breaking Singleton and you have multiple fetches, this card gets out of control, right? It's almost fetch-centric, Fabled Passages, etc. I don't care if it's Evolving Wilds. This card gains value from the ability to get multiple land triggers. When Stu was originally talking about this, and he made the joke about the bit was Tireless Tracker, Questing Beast. These two were highly impactful, but they're the only ones really holding that linchpin down of the Tireless Tracker in 3, Questing Beast in 4. And as May said, they represented immediate threats that can get out of control.
Even if you've just got Tireless Tracker down, right?
Yep.
And then on turn 4, play a fetch land, sack it. Now you've got 2 clues, crack both of them, draw 2 cards. That's huge. Especially for green. I really do believe that, right? You need that for green. You need to be drawing cards when your other creatures that you've put down only just are 1/1s or 0/1s and tap for mana and do nothing else. So now the fact that you've got to refill your hand a little bit is very, very important. And now you could have a 5/4. That's not to be trifled with, right? That attacks pretty significantly. And Questing Beast as a 4/4 attacks pretty significantly. They're great utility cards, again, but they're not great aggro. Questing Beast is a good aggro card. Tireless Tracker is not a good aggro card.
To this point, green actually at this had been sifting is what it had been doing. Its whole purpose was rampant growth, Kodama's Reach, removing your lands from your library, and then depleting, increasing the chances of gas, essentially, right? That was its pseudo draw, is by increasing the percentage of drawing something you'd want to play. There was a point where green was hitting this critical mass of production of so much mana. What do you cast, right? Like there's only so many mana dorks you can have before you have nothing to cast with the mana dorks.
And then the idea
mana is devalued.
Yeah, and the idea is that when you've got 6, 7, 8 mana, you're able to cast something that's just going to take over the game.
Right.
Right? But it's just not happening like it used to.
So there was actually a green deck that existed for a bit for the complete curveball off script. You're welcome. Is that getting into that turn 5 plow under to put your opponent behind for 2 turns and take away some of their mana was a huge turn. And it was a good moment that shined where green started to shift away from scary 3, 4, 5 creatures to kind of 3, 4, 5 anything else.
So now
that was the main point.
Well, no, that's a good point. It's a good point. Like but it's still, its purpose was almost utilitarian at that point, right? It wasn't about what it could do. But then we started getting cards, and this is going to be that unga bunga. How do you fill in that gap between 3, 4, and we'll do a little bit of 5 here. We've got cool cards, and this is going to be my powered vintage cube that I'm referencing. We got cards like Endurance for 1 colorless and 2 green. You get a creature elemental incarnation. Flash, that's what's going to make this card special. And another component here, Reach. Whenever Endurance enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. And then you can evoke it, exile a green card from your hand. So you can make this free, essentially, right? It's pretty powerful. And you can get a 3/4.
It's very powerful just by virtue of the fact that you can get a 3/4 with Reach for only 3 mana. Like, that's a wonderful curve.
Yep.
Right? I love that. And I think for a powered vintage environment, it just serves a great purpose because the graveyard is such an impactful zone in a vintage cube environment. But it's not a finisher.
It's not a finisher, but it has, what I do like about this is it has, we're going to call it pseudo haste on turn 4, right? Or yeah, I think I got that right. But because you get to flash it in, you now have an attacker that's relevant. That would be my argument.
Absolutely.
This actually gives you something. It's not a finisher, but it's definitely a card that suddenly becomes a relevant threat, and it has a good blocking body that can take care of your spirits and your Thopters and all these things.
Or a
right?
Dragon's Rage channeler,
it deals with your aggro package in a relevant way to allow you to continue to scale up so that you can play the game. And enough of these ideas and enough mass, it doesn't matter if it's a game finisher, it will take over a board state. May, do you have any thoughts on that?
Like the thing that I mentioned earlier, it has to do with just the complexity that has happened in Magic over time, is that more and more creatures have become these Mole Drifter type effects, or these effects that come in and they have to do something else. This is another example of, I can flash it in, put pressure on the control player to have to answer it during their turn, or it is just a big butt that prevents the little duders from just getting through. Sometimes just flash it again, getting rid of somebody's little 2/2 body or whatever is a good play. And that's something that you have to think about when you're looking at modern green packages. And a lot of curators haven't really adjusted to it because they're still in that traditional color pie mindset. It's the best way that I can put it.
And also, I will add to you, and I meant to say this before, when we're talking about this, fixing this green mid-range package, it doesn't just have to be creatures. It can be, right. There's a multitude of things Absolutely. You can do. It can even be token generators, lots of things you can do to fill that void that we're talking about. But this next card is, in fact, a creature. Stu, would you mind taking this away? I'm in love with this card. I was running it for a period in my Powered Vintage environment.
It's not a Power Vintage card.
It's a good middle of the road. So here's the thing. I want to have an on-screen deliberation with you, May.
Sure.
Stu and I were talking about my dorks. We're going through my list as we do. And he's like, Llanowar Elves, Findorn Elves. He's like, you don't need this one anymore.
Findorn Elves is not Vintage Power.
He says that.
But Delighted Halfling needs to replace it.
Here's my counterpoint. Yep. I'm running 540 cards. You'll never draft my entire cube. In order to have diversity, I'm not at 360. 360, I have the leisure of having this tight pattern within a Powered Vintage environment. But at 540, I can kind of loosen the reins a little bit, but also knowing that you're not always going to get these optimal cards. So this next card, the reason why I put it on the list, when you don't see Questing Beast in a draft, and it's not available in said draft at 540, you need options that play the game. Would you mind taking this one now and understanding that logic?
So this is Ulvenwald Oddity, 2 colorless and 2 green, for a 4/4 creature beast. It has trample and haste, and then you can pay 5 colorless and 2 green to transform Ulvenwald Oddity into Ulvenwald Behemoth, which is a 8/8 trample haste. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 and have trample and haste.
So with a bigger list, that stopgap, that doldrums I have is a lot more diverse, right? I don't
disagree.
I got a bigger power band.
This is not vintage. This is unplayable in Vintage Cube.
I disagree with that. May, do you?
I agree with Stu.
Really?
It's absolutely unplayable.
Don't get me wrong.
I'm going to ask the listeners.
I love Ulvenwald.
I love it too.
It's because I tend to curate a lot of lower power cubes. I tend to favor a lot of cubes that are budget friendly. And the reality is that this is a card that's just Questing Beast at home.
Yeah.
Well, it's worse. It's a worse Questing Beast.
Well, that was my point. At 540 cards, I'm going to have less
Questing
pool.
Beast at home is the insult. It is,
but
we have food at home. The food at home.
You need to have a second one, though, right? I mean, that's with everything, though. You need to have redundancy.
This is not a second one.
No, you don't.
It plays in the case of redundancy.
No.
I'm going to ask the listeners.
It's like saying that Arborback Stomper is the same thing as a Thragtusk.
You're always going to have a lesser tier. That's the same thing with what's the new Thragtusk? It's the Rhino.
It's good. It's a good thing. There are homes for this, and that's why I love it.
Vintage all right, listeners. We're going to get listeners to settle. We're going to go to the listener polls here on this one. Does this card qualify as Vintage Cube?
What you should do after this, we're going to record this episode.
I'm putting a poll out.
And put it out on the Twitters. Ulvenwald Oddity
debate
is in my Vintage Cube. Do you agree or disagree? I'm going to take a guess.
Perfect.
But here's a 4-drop that belongs. And again, going back to the archetype or to the card types, right? Definitely, this deserves to be in. Garruk Wildspeaker, yes. 2 colorless, 2 green. Planeswalker Garruk comes in with 3 loyalty, +1 untap 2 target lands. -1, put a 3/3 green beast creature token onto the battlefield, or -4 Overrun, which is +3/+3 for all of your creatures and gain trample. Undoubtedly, this is a card that belongs in a Vintage Cube. In any way that you are playing green, if you can get this out with enough dorks, put this out. You only need to untap 2 target lands once and then do -4 once if you've got enough creatures out, and you're probably threatening to take the game over, right? This is a solid card. Even if you just look at the untap 2 target lands, that by itself for the next turn, now it's got 4 loyalty. You can ramp this out pretty quickly, and that is a very, very relevant ability for a lot of archetypes, the fact that you can untap 2 target lands. Very, very cool effect, but it's not an aggro effect.
Which brings together a good point, though, is that Planeswalkers do a fantastic job of filling that gap whenever you don't have creature. Because right now, going back to the Ulvenwald Oddity versus the Questing Beast conversation, right? And they've both said Questing Beast was in and a vintage, but Ulvenwald Oddity didn't make it. But Garruk Wildspeaker, at the same converted mana cost as Ulvenwald Oddity, does a lot more utilitarian role, does a lot more components, but also produces a creature. Planeswalkers can be used as that filler, right? And they're value add filler. As a matter of fact, David McDarby talked about this in the Live the Dream environment. He was specifically using Rock, the green-black Golgari, as supplementing it with Planeswalkers to really give it that leading edge to carry it through so that it had something to do while you're building up to your big crescendo. So that's kind of the point of this episode, is how do we make green not just mana dork, and then haymaker, right? And this is how you kind of do it. You have to have components. I'm going to stick to my guns on Ulvenwald Oddity. If you have
Go for it.
540
Fine
plus,
hill to die
I would
on.
say 540 plus 720, somewhere in that gap, you're okay. This would never in my mind make a 360 list. This would struggle at a 450 list. But when I get to these larger lists where I have to have cube diversity because it never gets drafted, this is not a shameful card to be in there.
This
it's
card
not on the same tier.
Is literally played nowhere. Nowhere.
It's in Uberbear's Horror Cube.
It's in your horror cube, which is a thematic cube, and your vintage cube. It's literally played nowhere else.
So let's move on
So
to our
it's
next.
either gotta be vintage,
I have notes.
sure legacy, sure modern, plenty of disgustingly powerful cards in all of those formats, right?
Where
This
does, where does Questing Beast show up at?
Vintage.
vintage.
Okay.
Shows up in a vintage
What?
cube.
What? I don't understand the
No,
question.
you said it was for the
Anyways, let me
formats.
bring us back
There's-
on the rails.
There's no
Because
no
I want
home
to talk
for that.
about Rook. I've been begging to talk about
She wants to talk about Garruk.
Thank you. Now, Green's role has changed in a lot of higher power environments, and you as a curator need to keep in mind that scary Questing Beast cards aren't going to be your bread and butter for a lot of cases, but things like Rook are perfect because they are scary value pieces that can be ramped into. And while they are that perfect filler into that dead zone, it is a scary card because of its value throughout. It is something worth ramping into, and Green wants to lean into that. And when you are building your cube and thinking about things in that slot that you want to ramp into, Planeswalkers are great for filling that slot. Which brings us into the next Planeswalker that we should talk about. Stu, would you like to talk about it?
So this is Nissa, Who Shakes the World. 3 colorless and 2 green for a legendary planeswalker, Nissa. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. Nissa has +1, put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still land. And then you have -8, bit of a jump. You get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, tapped, then shuffle your library.
Yeah, this card's nuts.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Pretty good.
It's
Pretty
pretty
good.
good.
It's
But
like not the most powerful Nissa, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, but very, very powerful card.
I would say I don't
It's
know
a
if
great
either,
5-drop.
I don't
It's
know.
a
If,
great card.
and the next one that Stu debates is the better version of Nissa. I don't know
what
if
does Nissa do?
All right. The next one that Stu debates is better, but I don't know if I necessarily agree, but I think it's great, is Nissa, the Ascended Animist. For three colorless, 2 forest, and 2 green Phyrexian mana, get a legendary planeswalker Nissa. And it is completed, which is a really sad ending for Nissa, but I think they rewound that. But you can pay the Phyrexian mana or 2 life, and for each time you paid that with life, this planeswalker enters the battlefield with 2 fewer loyalty counters.
So it's either you pay 7 mana,
Yep.
comes in as 7, pay 6 mana,
Comes in
and
as
2
5.
Phyrexian comes in as
4. Comes in 4. Yep, because it reduces by 2 each time you do it.
Yeah.
So, then the +1 is create an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token where X is Nissa's Ascended Animus loyalty. Then the -1 is destroy target artifact or enchantment. And then the -7 is until the end of the turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample.
So at least
Lots of
the
words.
+1 is getting you
A body.
a 3/3
Yep.
green Phyrexian,
Mhm.
right? Next turn, maybe a 4/4. if you pay all the mana, right, now you're getting a 7/7, and then an 8/8, and then a 9/9. Pretty powerful.
It's big. Yep, I like it. And the reason why we're putting this in that
big.
class was because of the Phyrexian mana. May, you have something to add to that?
Yes, not only is this card great because it scales and you're happy to ramp into it at 5, 6, or be your big stupid haymaker later, but what's really important to note about the 3 planeswalkers that we mentioned is that in green, these all make creatures to protect themselves. They are all able to protect themselves creature-wise. And the fact that if your opponent's not able to answer those creatures or the planeswalker itself immediately, right, it means that they will eventually take over the game. So not only are they a threat later, but they are a threat now.
Yeah, agreed. Especially like that Nissa. I've watched Vintage Cube games with that Nissa that just starts pumping out those Phyrexian tokens, and it just ends games. Like, it's very, very difficult unless you have a bunch of flyers or unless you've already done a bunch of damage to really get through a board like that. And again, I think that's beautifully put. Anytime you have a planeswalker that has the ability to protect itself, a la Nissa, a la Grist, a la even Oko, because you're Okoing, you're elking someone's big flyer or whatever, and you've already got a 1/1 elk, or turn your food into an elk, it just makes that planeswalker so much more impactful.
So that kind of ties off the Vintage Cube section, right? Like we're
not done with that. Don't even think about it. We're coming back to that, Anthony.
All right, yeah. So now we're going to move over to the we're going to kind of move over to the peasant cube uncommon environments, right? I wanted to show in the show notes in particular is that this isn't just a kind of a thing that green has a problem with just in a vintage cube environment. Green, we're going to give you a solution for each type of environment. And in this case, it's going to be Sandwich's Peasant Cube that's featured at CubeCon 2023. And if you haven't got a chance to play that, I hope you did by the time this show came out. It's going to be absolutely amazing, but Stu and I will be playing it soon. But he's got some gifts that have been given him recently that really, he had this similar problem, right? Where Green had this weird, like, haymaker. He had access to all the dorks and then get to the haymaker, right? And it looked a lot like the curve of a vintage cube. Well, how did Chris fix that? The first one he did was Riskar, the Pima Renegade. For 2 colorless and 1 green, you get a legendary creature, Elf Druid, 2/2. Whenever Riskar, Pima Renegade enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has tap, add 1 green mana.
Stabilizes.
And ramps. Yep.
Aggressive. Phenomenal card.
Absolutely.
Love Rishkar so
Love
much.
this card.
And he got
The important thing
downgraded.
to note is that because it's peasants, their selection of planeswalkers are just worse.
Yep.
And that's just the nature of the rarity restriction. And Rishkar does a great, I would say, impersonation of Garruk in a way. And it comes down, it can potentially make your 2 creatures be able to tap for green immediately. Or it can just put a counter on itself and something else to be able to turn sideways with later.
I would say I would say and,
it's a
not
lot
even
of
an or. I
things.
think it's an and. It gives it the ability to ramp
Exactly.
and protect itself.
Exactly. And a card like this is perfect for a peasant environment, and the reason why we're able to do it is just because it recently got downshifted, which really exemplifies what I'm trying to point out with complexity creep. Forever ago, this was a rare. And the fact that this is now at uncommon should say a lot about the state of Magic cards right now.
Yep.
This next
Which
card,
is just
though,
something that you have to work around as a curator.
Mm-hmm.
So
this next card is the flagship for Pauper and Peasant, and it has never, ever disappointed in a draft. This card is wild, and it's always been common. And if you have a Pauper cube and you are looking to deal with this problem that we're talking about here, if you're not running Bannerhide Cruciak, for 3 colorless and 1 green, you get a creature beast, trample. You reinforce 2, pay 1 green and 1 forest, discard this card, put 2 1/1 counters on target creature, or you can scavenge it later for 5 colorless and 2 green, exile this card from your graveyard, put a number of 1/1 counters equal to this card's power on target creature, scavenge only as a sorcery, and is a 4/4 body. This card is word soup, and it's always been common, and this is a huge draft pick.
4/4 for 4/4 trample for 4 mana.
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
With basically the ability to get it out of your graveyard
is
later.
Nuts. And this is a common.
Always been.
Common.
Yep. It's crazy.
I will note, because I've been specifically looking at the common 4-drops for green for a long time, is that for a long time before this card came out, is that our next best 4/4 trampler was Fierce Witchstalker, which was from Eldraine, which just comes in, makes a food, and it has just a 4/4 trampler. That was our next best. And I like me some Fierce Witchstalker, right? But this is a combat trick, it's modal, and it could be paid off later. It does everything that you're looking for. It is a perfect card to highlight here.
Absolutely. This next one's one that we kind of talked about. We've been talking about Tireless Tracker on multiple occasions now, but now we're going to talk about Tireless Provisioner. And why does this matter to Peasant and Pauper cubes? Is because they recently got this little suite of pseudo fetches when they enter the battlefield, gain a life, right? And they do trigger this on multiple occasions because of ETBs and LTBs out.
Yep.
Tireless Provisioner has a value add to fill in that gap, that dead zone for your, in this case, your peasant environments. If you're looking for this, because you don't want to keep doing the dork haymaker, right? That's how we get past this. Tireless Provisioner for 2 colorless and 1 green, you get a creature elf scout 3/2. And the elf may matter as well too, because sometimes they run elf ball in a lot of these environments, right? Landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. Let's stop on the food token for a minute. A lot of times in the peasant environments, they're creature centric, creature heavy. The life total matters more there than it typically does like in a powered vintage environment that we highlighted before. So that 3 life is extremely relevant here. And of course the treasure moves you forward. But this
Wonderful
card does
to
a lot.
have the option, right? You can either press the issue if you feel like you're ahead and you want to take that treasure and you want to pump it out into another value creature, or maybe you're behind a little bit and you're thinking, okay, I need to just put this body out, maybe stabilize, gain that extra, 3 life. 3 life is not to be trifled with, or not to be poo-pooed, to say the least. Very, very good card.
So we can make that treasure and ramp into this next card. May, would you mind taking this one away? We're going to crack our treasure and we're going to cast this.
How are we cracking a treasure in order to class this? It's Goreclaw, Terror of and it's 3 and a green, 4 that you don't got that. Legendary creature bear, and creatures you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Fantastic. And whenever she attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and trample until end of turn. Hey, I like big, stupid, go wide, +1/+1 gains trample things, especially at 4 mana.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Great job in Peasant Cubes to help fill in that dead zone, that green. This is the Unga Bunga at home for uncommons subsets. But that's enough about the peasant environments. I mean, I wanted to kind of roll over. We've kind of done, just to top it off, we've done some vintage, how to fill in that stopgap.
Let's talk about a specific cube.
Yep, let's go.
May,
how did you solve this problem in your environment?
Tell us about your cube. Yeah.
So, I actually developed a very special package. And while I'm not going to talk about the entirety of the package, because it's like 8 different cards, I wanted to highlight 3 that I think can belong in a lot of lower power environments, peasant environments, whatnot. And I call it the Awoo package. And it's essentially a collection of wolf and wolf generating cards that put pressure on your opponents in a roundabout way, kind of. So, as we know, being able to flash things in and puts pressure on the control player to have to answer it during their turn. However, the first card here, Wolfier Avenger, which is 1 green, creature wolf warrior 3/3 with flash. But you can also pay 1 and a green to regenerate it, which means that if you play it on turn 3 and you flash it in to, say, eat an attacker or to pressure the blue player, they now have to waste mana on their turn in order to answer it. If you're going against a red player, they now have to consider whether or not they can want to burn it now or burn it later, because being able to regenerate and put pressure on their removal is huge. Put pressure on the control player is huge. And it's an on-rate body that's hard to get rid of. And that is a huge part for green. Going to dork into this feels really good in my environment, because in my environment, it's slow, it's control-y, it's value-based. And being able to force your opponent to interact on their own turn can be huge for you unlocking your turn 4.
This next one you have on your list exemplifies what we talked about before. It kind of fits into that role where we talked about it didn't just have to be a creature in your powered vintage environment. It could be a planeswalker. Well, in this case, you've included Predator's Howl, which is an instant. also fills the role, right? For 3 colorless and 1 green, you get an instant, put a 2/2 green wolf token onto the battlefield. Not an amazing rate for that portion, but the next portion is what
Best
makes it
keyword ever?
morbid. Put 3 2/2 green wolf creature tokens onto the battlefield instead if a creature died this turn. It is fantastic placing those sacrifice strategies and put 6 power distributed on the board for 4 mana, which is powerful for a low-power thematic environment.
Yeah, I love getting 3 permanents for 1 card and only 4 mana, and it's 3 2/2s. That's great value.
Sometimes that disbursement
The rate
matters.
is insane.
Yeah.
And the thing that really pushed it out was the fact that you could play super aggressive cards for your 1/2, etc. Or you can have your dorks there, so that way if somebody ends up removing something later, then you can use your dork to ramp into this on turn 3.
Yep.
So say if you play some relevant 2-drop, right? And then they end up trying to answer it on turn 3 or whatever before you get a chance to use it, then you can actually bring out Predator's Howl later, right? So the Morbid puts a lot of pressure on your opponent for when you're turning sideways, for when you're ramping, and it fills that curve out really, really nicely because you want to be putting pressure on your opponent, and getting 3 bodies at 2/2 each is huge.
Yeah.
And initially this got cut because it was a little too strong, but I ended up putting it back in because as the power level of the Fake Cube is kind of regulated around the 4, 5, etc. slots, I needed this slot in particular to be pushed.
It would be awful for my opponent if they, decided to destroy my dork and I floated mana in response and then paid 4 and got 3 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. Sorry, opponent.
Exactly.
So another one that really pushes this idea, and I like that you've done this, the diversity, to help listeners understand, again, to push it again, doesn't have to be just creatures to fill that gap, right? You can count these as creatures if you so wish within your count, but I like what you've done here. And the next card, Stu, would you mind taking this one away, please?
This is Raised by Wolves. This is a 3 colorless, 2 green enchantment aura, enchant creature. When Raised by Wolves enters the battlefield, put 2 2/2 green wolf creature tokens onto the battlefield. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each wolf you control. This is a little bit glass cannony for me, right? But it's aggro.
Because it's an aura.
And I want aggro.
All auras
I
are
want to
glass
go
candy.
bananas. I want to push the envelope. I want to hit you as hard as I can. And this is incredible for that, right? You're getting 4 power. You're getting +3 power on whatever creature, or +2 power on whatever you're putting this enchantment on. What a wonderful and flavorful aggro card this is. And
I love it
it's
for
just
low power
incredible. It's
environments
great.
because one of the biggest issues with auras just in general is that they kind of come down, get removed, and don't do anything.
Yes.
This comes down, makes 2 bodies, and then it powers up whatever it's attached to. But if you curve into this, say, from the Predators, etc., right, or from the Wolfier Avenger, right, going into Raised by Wolf with any other of these wolf pieces or any of the other woo package that I'm not going to mention, because again, it's just a lot of cards and we don't have a lot of time. But if you have any of those other pieces out that are already putting pressure, this is a great 5-drop. And this is worth ramping into for a lot of cases in my environment because it's going to be slower and it's going to be more around getting those attrition-based choices. And this gives you that attrition. This gives you those additional bodies that you can push into victory.
Yeah, I'm putting this on a low value creature. Like, put it on a 1/1, put it on a 2/2. Like, I'm more than happy to turn a 1/1 or a 2/2 into a 3/3 or a 4/4. Now you kind of have to get rid of that because it's hitting pretty hard, but I've already got these 2/2/2s from value out of it. Like, it's great. And again, I've said this on this episode, I've said it on previous episodes. I love getting multiple permanents for the cost of only 1 card.
And this next card, it's not included in May's Fey Cube, but it's fantastic for anywhere you're looking to get that tie that binds for that Unga Bunga package for something that it's going to be vanilla-ish, but huge on rate for an efficient cost, and that's going to be Love Struck Beast. For 2 colorless and 1 green, you get a Beast Noble. So it's going to be a adventure card, and that's what I love about this. The modality sets this card apart, right? So we're going to start with the first part. It's Heart's Desire for 1 green. So you do this on turn 1. Sorcery, Adventure, create a 1/1 human creature token. That's pretty good, right? That's just a 1-for-1. Did it. Okay. The next portion of it is now you cast the beast for its 2 colorless and 1 green. Lovestruck Beast can't attack unless you control a 1/1 creature for a 5/5 body. Very leatherback Baloth-centric-ish.
I ain't worried about the restriction.
It's just a beatdown card. This is straight up dumb beatdown card.
And there's plenty of 1/1 mana dorks.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Plenty of ways to enable this card, and 5/5
Working
for
this
3.
turn 2 feels good.
It does.
Yeah, sure does.
And there's nothing sophisticated about it. It's just elegant. It's going to get the job done, and it gives you something to do in that dead space that green has oftentimes fallen into. It just stops at 2 and never begins at 6. How do you fill that in, right? And we're kind of giving you that cards that you can pour into that. And you have this list, this show notes will give you all kinds of diversity to choose from. You can cherry pick from these and go, what fits your type of environment, the speed, the theme, whatever. And you can just kind of do what we've done here.
Well,
But
I'm glad.
I think it's a universal problem, though.
I'm glad that we didn't just have a 5-second episode with me saying Tyler's Tracker and Questing Beast. I think this was important. And, maybe my attitude's changed a little bit.
So we're going to move over to final thoughts. So giving green an identity, it's important. You have to bolster it up, right? Not everything is going to work, as we talked about. Just looking at the deliberation we had between Ovenwall, Oddity, and Questing Beast, you can see where the environmental context really does shape people's opinions.
Yes, one of those is a very good card. One of them is not.
and then you can see where it's important to get like the card selection she said this, the cards that fill these slots need to be impactful. They need to do something interesting to incentivize your drafters to even want to play these. Maybe they want to curve out at 5, right? So you need to choose stuff that has a lot of modality, a lot of player choice, agency, right?
Well, let's talk about that from the Fey Cube, right? Because you've obviously put these cards in there, right? These are Fey Cube cards. They're in the show notes. You want this to be a choice for your drafters. You want them to have this option to be able to go from just putting a dork or 2 into play in the very early turns to having those mid-range options that can create a threat, that can create a threatening board state for the player to prevent their opponents from just running over them with either card value or card advantage or whatever. So this is an important gap that you're filling in with these cards.
Yeah, well, if we're going to mention this specific thing, I might as well talk about the backbone of my cube-specific package. I didn't want to mention it just because it's not really universal like the rest of my AWU packages, but in the Fey Cube in particular, we have Ren's Run Packmaster as a 4-drop. It's 3 and a green, Elf Warrior, 5/5, Champion, and Elf. Hence why it's pretty Fey exclusive. And you can pay 2 and a green to put a green wolf creature token into play. Each wolf you control has Death Touch. So not only is this big stompy, but you can use the dorks that ramped into this to champion, and that is huge. That is a huge synergy piece that people are going to look for when they're drafting, and that's what made the backbone of the AWU deck in the Fey Cube. And while I believe that a lot of the AWU package that I have in my cube can be applied to a lot of other lower power environments, this one in particular happens to highlight, hey, a lot of my dorks happen to be elves, and a lot of these elves can champion into this on turn 4. And when it does, you get this very scary, very relevant mana dump that makes a bunch of 2/2 Death Touchers.
And how do you feel that that's impacted that? Like, someone comes along, they want to just draft green. Has that given them what they need to be able to draft that green package?
Absolutely.
And to be relevant? And where's that power band? Is it in that, like, are those powerful enough to say, you know what, you only kind of need to be in that space and you're threatening games quickly? Is it more like filling in for maybe when they get to that 6, 7, 8 mana sort of stage of a game? Or is it powerful enough that they're being able to end games with those cards earlier on?
Pre-Wilds of Eldraine, it was definitely one of the strongest cards in the environment. Very intentionally so to signpost that overlap between elves and wolves. But ever since Wild of Eldraine came out, and now that there are just a higher density of adventure cards and whatnot, this card now just feels very good for this environment. It feels very healthy, and I think that it's in a good spot. And I think that this is a great example of something that you can think about when you're creating your own thing is as things change and environments change for all the rest of your colors, sometimes things that used to be too strong, you might want to go back to and think, reconsider those.
So I think
Cool.
I think a good tie-off for this is it's a universal concept between all different types of rarity levels, right? Thematic and rarity. Green has oftentimes suffered from being, as we summarized it, that utility color, right? The glue, where you kind of jumped over from dork to haymaker. Well, we're trying to make green better by adding these components that do a lot of things, provide modality, diversity, and choices to your players and your drafters. And so that they want to keep playing again. And sometimes they don't want to go all the way to the Crater Hoof Behemoths of the world, right? Don't want to carry it all the way. And this gives them an option. So the Unga Bungas of the world and the AU packages, etc. There's something that you can look at and kind of, as a curator, harness that to make green have more mid-range legitimate threats. And I'll say that in closing, I did this with Uberbear's Horror Cube with werewolves. They serve my purpose. And other than that, we're going to move over to the socials.
All right. As always, to all of our listeners, thank you very much for tuning into this show. And if you've not listened to any of our previous, go ahead and check us out and give us a 5-star review on whatever your chosen podcast platform is. We really appreciate it. Help us get out there to more and more Magic the Gathering listeners. Go check out our affiliate link on ultrasleeves.com/UberCube. Go and get 5% off your purchase. You want to go check out Ultrasleeves for some awesome bling for your cube or, you know, whatever other Magic format you're playing. Really awesome products there. Love their stuff. Again, go check them out. If you want to support the show, you can also use our Inked Gaming affiliate link. They have an awesome selection of playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, and all kinds of cool custom products available for your cube, commander deck, whatever the case may be. You can find us on Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can reach out to us via email. We are UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And as always, come hit us up on the Discord, #UberCube. Go check out the Deck Bows channel. Go check out even just the general channel. A lot of cool discussion going on right now about cubes and about CubeCon and about everything else. Deck Bows from CubeCon. I want to see plenty of those.
Yep.
And finally,
Want to see your decks.
we want to see the decks. Tell us about the Patreon. Give them a shout out.
Yeah, our Patreon, good friend Stephen Conenfall recently joined our Patreon, and he sent me a message and goes, I thought this was a meme. I didn't know that I could actually contribute to it. We have been doing the gag reel for so long, but I want to say thank you to Stephen. I want to say thank you to Preston and Sam for supporting the show. And
Thank
if
you to
anybody
all
else
the
wishes to support
Patreons.
the show.
Absolutely.
And the example that we've used before is with our good friend Preston. We've already written one episode. We're going to write another. We truly appreciate the support. We're recording this pre-CubeCon, so hopefully that we're going to have a great time at CubeCon, aren't we? We're going to be
so
amazing.
excited.
Everything's
We're all
gonna-
gonna
I'm
be
going to
there.
have fun. It's
All
going
the
to be a
crew.
blast.
It's going to be a
All the
blast.
crew.
But other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube, and is Happy birthday!
Ramping. Happy ramping.
Happy birthday.
Perfect.